is Wallace Stegner so widely read, but perhaps not as widely acknowledged as one of our great American writers? A.O. Scott will be here to talk about Wallace Stegner and his legacy. How did Sesame Street and Schoolhouse Rock revolutionize children's television? David Kamp will join us to talk about his new book, Sunny Days. Plus, our critics will talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's June 5th. I'm Pamela Paul. A.O. Scott joins us now. He is a critic at large for The Times and has just embarked on a series of essays for the Book Review looking at American writers this week, starting with Wallace Stegner. Tony, thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be with you, Pamela.
So I want to talk a little bit about you and your job right now before we get into Stegner, because you are on the culture desk of The Times, reviewing normally films, although looking at other things now as a critic at large. Like, what does the landscape look like? What does a critic's work look like for you right now?
Well, it looks very strange because for the last 20 years at The Times, most of what I've been doing is writing about and reviewing new movies, and often complaining about just how there were too many new movies to keep track of. And now there are almost no new movies. There are some things that are coming out on streaming and on video on demand, but the whole landscape and ecology of my job as a film critic has been, at least one hopes, temporarily suspended or upended by the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm spending a lot of time at home, like everybody else, watching things. And also, thanks to you and this project, which we cooked up before the quarantine, spending a lot of time reading. And one of the nice things, I have to say, or one of the silver linings about this situation, is the diminishing amount of new stuff means I can turn my attention back to some older stuff, which is something I've always liked to do and never felt like I had enough time or bandwidth to do. So writing about classic movies or writing about books by authors who've maybe been a little bit neglected or fallen by the wayside is just a really satisfying thing to be able to do. And it's great to have space and time to do it in the Times.
I'm stuck a little bit on the idea of like a speculative short fiction in which all of the sort of long unheard cries of various people have been answered. Like your cry of if only there were fewer movies, and like other people like if only I could work from home one day a week, just one, I ask. And like all of that has been answered in this very cruel and deadly way. But that's not what you're writing about. You are writing about Wallace Stegner. And the idea behind this series was to look at specifically American writers. We kind of toyed around a little bit with what would the parameters be. Why did you settle on writing specifically about American writers, and what about these particular American writers that you are going to cover in the series?
Well, American writing, American literature is a longstanding interest of mine. I mean, it went back many decades ago when I thought I was going to be an English professor. It was American literature that really captured my attention and stimulated my imagination. And before I became a film critic, I was a book critic, and I sort of had an idea of a book that I never wrote and will never write on American writing, in particular American fiction in the 20th century. And one of the reasons I thought of wanting to kind of go back to some of the writers that I had been thinking about back then, and to some that I was kind of curious to discover or to rediscover, is that American literature, it's always seemed to me, presents a much richer and more complicated, just a different landscape from what we tend to perceive or how we tend to think about this country in political discourse or social science or journalism or any of those kind of neat packages that we wrap up our national experience in. And I thought it might be helpful just as a sort of corrective or just a respite from this intensely conflictual and political way of talking that we're used to read some of these writers.
What were some of those big questions that Stegner wrestled with in his writing?
Stegner is such a fascinating writer. For one thing, and I don't really get into this into the piece, but he really spans generations. I don't think there are that many writers who cover quite the same amount of time as he does. So he was born in 1909 and grew up in various places around the Western United States, Seattle, Salt Lake City, and not just the United States, Saskatchewan. But he started writing in the 30s. His first 4 novels were published in the 30s and kept writing and kept going up until his death in 1993. The big novels that people tend to read, the 2 that are probably the most read, Angle of Repose and Crossing to Safety, are from the 70s and 80s. And he already had, 4 or 5 decade career behind him at that point. It's almost a cliche to think of him as a Western writer because he taught at Stanford for many years. He founded the creative writing program at Stanford, and the creative writing fellowships still bear his name there. A lot of his nonfiction is about the West, about ecology, about the settlement of the West. He wrote a really fascinating book in the 40s called Mormon Country about Utah and the settlement of Utah and the conflicts between Mormon and non-Mormon populations and Native Americans there. So the West is kind of his big theme, but it's always in opposition to the Western, as we think of in movies or in popular Western literature, the sort of the mythology of the West. So the whole idea of cowboys and railroad men and rugged individualists and the whole myth of Western expansion and Western settlement is something that he's always looking at from a very critical angle.
When we think about this idea of like the great American writer and the great American novel, which is probably all just a false notion, Wallace Stegner feels like in many people's minds, like a tier below that. People know of Wallace Stegner. They know the title, usually Angle of Repose and Crossing to Safety, both books that sold very well in addition to being critical successes. But he's not one of those people that's on the curriculum, for example. You said in your essay that he's the writer that you come across on shelves of books where you rent a cabin for the summer, and there are inevitably a copy or 2 of worn paperbacks of his novels. And that's the way I came across Stegner. What is his reputation in the country? Did he get the recognition that he deserved?
I think in his lifetime, he was pretty well recognized. He won or was a finalist for most of the major awards, the Pulitzer and the National Book Award. And he was a very powerful and important figure in the world of creative writing. I mean, the list of his students, includes Wendell Berry, Edward Abbey, Tilly Olson, Robert Stone, Larry McMurtry, Ken Kesey. So the people who passed through Stanford and were Stegner Fellows there is part of his legacy in American writing, kind of off to the side of whether people are still reading his books. But I think there is this interesting status where it's not that he's obscure, forgotten, neglected, but feels a little bit marginal to me, a little bit maybe unassimilated.
Crossing to Safety is not really a Western novel at all. I mean, it takes place in the Midwest and in Vermont, but perhaps he gets that reputation most of all from Angle of Repose. Tell us about that book.
Angle of Repose was published in the early 70s, and he took early retirement from Stanford to work on it. And it takes place in the years after the Civil War. And it's one of the few novels that's not based as much on his own family and his own life as it is on other real people. So there are real life models for the couple at the center of this book. An elite Massachusetts woman who marries an ambitious young engineer and goes out west with him. And it's the story of their marriage and their moving around to different parts of the West, to Idaho, to California. And she becomes successful. She sells drawings and stories about the West to magazines back east. So it's partly about the invention of the West as a literary idea, even as it's also about the settlement and development of the West as a region and as an economic space. And then that's told through the perspective of her grandson, who is a retired historian who's putting together the story of his grandmother's life. So it's a multi-generational story. It's very rich. It's very absorbing. It kind of shifts back and forth the time from the late 1960s to the 1880s and 90s and early 20th century. And it's a very satisfying book. It's very satisfying, somewhat old-fashioned kind of read, just the way that it tells the family story in this very richly detailed, but also very decorous way.
Another theme in your essay and a theme of Stegner's was marriage. And, again, we think of him as this Western writer, these big landscapes, the natural world, wide open prairies and mountains. But he really wrote a lot about human relationships. What made his writing about marriage interesting?
He was committed to monogamy in his writing. That isn't to say that there isn't the potential and the occasional reality of adultery, which is a great subject for the novel since the beginning of novels. But he's just really interested in these lasting bonds between people. So in Big Rock Candy Mountain, Bo and Elsa Mason are the main couple, and it's about their decades of marriage. They're very much based on Stegner's own parents. And it's the story of how a woman from a very proper Norwegian family in Minnesota runs away from home, basically, and goes out west to the Dakotas first and meets this guy who's running a pool hall and will later become a bootlegger and a gambler and is kind of a bit of a rough character, and falls in love with him, and they get married and they make their way kind of itinerantly and precariously across the West in the years from 1904 and 1905 when they meet through the Great Depression. And that's very much based on Stegner's own parents. And he's trying to explore in that the mystery of how two fundamentally incompatible people nonetheless stick it out and get along and endure and stay with each other for better and very often for worse. And in Crossing to Safety, that's kind of doubled because it's a story of two marriages and of the friendship between two married couples, also based on Stegner and his own wife, Mary, and very close friends of theirs. And these couples meet in the 30s as junior faculty at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and then stay friends for decades after, mostly because of the summers that they spend together in Vermont. One of the couples is better off and from a fancier background than the other, so they have this place up in Vermont where the other more struggling, more striving couple comes to visit. And very little happens in this novel. I mean, it's not a hugely dramatic book, but it's really sustained by the fascination with how these four people get along, how they're different, how they're compatible, what it is that sticks them together, and the mysteries of human affection. And that struck me as I was rereading him and reading some other things for the first time as such a rich and interesting and in some ways underexplored literary subject. How do people get along? How do people stay connected to each other? How does that work?
When I talked about Stegner's Crossing to Safety on the podcast a few weeks ago, I got a lot of letters from listeners, enthusing about Stegner. It's like, I didn't know that there were still so many fans out there, and there are. And I got emails from Mylene Magalinden and Rita Maggio and Judith Dunham. But I want to just mention one from Annie Philbrick, who is the owner of Bank Square Books in Mystic, Connecticut, because she recommended a few of his books. And then I want to end with your recommendation. She said, try Stegner's Remembering Laughter, his first book, Recapitulation, and A Shooting Star. All are great. I hadn't heard of any of them. I'm curious if you have a recommendation, a particular favorite. Is it one of these big three, or is there somewhere else that people should start with reading Stegner?
Well, I think there are a few. I mean, I would say my absolute favorite and, a candidate for my top whatever all-time books is probably Big Rock Candy Mountain, which is a more sprawling and in some ways maybe less disciplined book because he was younger when he wrote it. But it's just an amazing book. And the characters are so vivid, and some of the set pieces, some of the episodes within it are just extraordinary. And Recapitulation, which you just mentioned, is the sequel to it. Many years later, the younger son of Bo and Elsa Mason, the main couple in Big Rock Candy Mountain, comes back to Salt Lake City where he had spent his adolescence and his college years and kind of remembers what it was like in the 20s and 30s there. And those books together, they're not like anything else that I've read. I don't know what to compare them to because they're so real in a way. The characters and the places, there's so much information and so much kind of dense human connection in them. The other book that I think is really interesting, which is kind of a mixed bag, but an interesting window into Stegner's sensibility, is a book he wrote from the 60s called All the Little Live Things. And it's a kind of grumpy old man book about the 60s and hippies and kids and how the younger generation, the boomers, who are now, of course, the older generation who were blaming for everything, were the younger generation who everyone was blaming for everything then. It's an uneven book, and it's a book that you can quarrel with, but the voice in it of this kind of Stegner alter ego, a kind of a retired literary agent living outside of San Francisco in Northern California. It's a very sharp and funny and cantankerous novel. And that's another one that I don't think is very much read and is worth checking out.
Well, Tony, when you're done with this series of essays, The Americans, Writers Who Show Us Who We Are, I feel like what's next is the Grumpy Old Man novel. All right. Always a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thanks so much.
Great talking with you, Pamela. Thanks.
A.O. Scott is a critic at large for the New York Times. He has been a longtime co-chief film critic for the Times, and he is the author of the book Better Living Through Criticism. Tony, thanks again.
Thank you.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. David Kamp joins us now. He is a longtime writer for Vanity Fair. His new book is called Sunny Days, The Children's Television Revolution That Changed America. David, thanks so much for being here.
Pamela, it's a delight to be here.
So you've written a number of books on a wide range of subjects, food and film and wine, the United States of Arugula. What brought you to 70s television as a subject?
Well, two things. One, I think I was looking for something that would bring uplift both to myself as a reporter, researcher, and as a reader. And the other thing is that I was part of Generation Zero of Sesame Street. I was 3 years old in 1969 when it premiered. And the further away I get from that time, when we had Sesame Street, the electric company, Mr. Rogers, Free to Be You and Me, etc., I find that era extraordinary. There's nothing like it has happened since in terms of educational children's programming.
All right, I want to get to the television in a second, but I'm curious about why you wanted Uplift. Why Uplift?
Well, interestingly, the premise for this book occurred to me in 2015, which was, before the 2016 election, obviously before the pandemic. But even then, I was kind of feeling a certain brokenness to society. And I thought that period of the late 60s and early 70s, at least vis-a-vis people like Jim Henson, Mr. Rogers, Joan Gans Cooney, was anomalous in that you had adults truly of noble intent who put aside financial incentive just to really do good for the purpose of doing good.
I guess it's sort of awful to think of yourself as a part of a trend, but there has been a recent spate of interest. I mean, certainly in Mr. Rogers with the documentary that came out a few years ago. I'm curious if you have a sense of why we're experiencing this wave of nostalgia right now. Like, is this a rare instance of a Gen X cultural phenomenon?
Well, I think it's Gen X, but I think it's wider than that because, interestingly, Morgan Neville, who directed Won't You Be My Neighbor, the documentary about Fred Rogers, I know him. And also Tom Junot, whose Esquire piece that inspired the Tom Hanks Mr. Rogers feature, I know him too. But none of us knew that the other was working on a project about this era. And I think that speaks to a kind of collective hankering for a more civil and more civically minded time. And we all sense that something has been lost that perhaps can be regained. One thing I admire about the much maligned millennials and Generation Z people is that they seem to be putting experience ahead of careerism. And I think that a lot of boomers and Generation X people got caught up in careerism and making money ahead of their ideals. And I think that's kind of what drew me back to this period. It really was a period where, again, anomalously, people really did seem to put their ideals ahead of financial incentives.
I have to defend Gen X a little bit here in that I wonder if for Gen X it was that sense of economic insecurity that drove, more than careerism and sort of money for money's sake, because this is a generation that graduated into a recession. This is the generation that was the children of the Depression and war era silent generation. I sort of think of Gen X as kind of constantly motivated by fear and impending despair.
That may be true, and I'm a member of Gen X myself. But I still feel that we kind of fell short of what Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morissette, who co-founded Sesame Street, did. I'm not going to bash Gen X because I think we actually benefited from learning the lessons of Free to Be You and Me and Sesame Street and Schoolhouse Rock. I'm Just a Bill.
Yes, although I found that a very depressing segment, I'm Just a Bill.
Just because the Bill himself was so forlorn with his paper forelock?
He was so forlorn, and it was just so hard for him to become a law. You just sort of felt like this is nigh impossible, and it was even easier back then. But to get to the point of your thesis that you describe these programs, Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, Electric Company, my personal favorite, which I want to deep dive on later, The Magic Garden, which was a tri-state area program, as part of the children's liberation movement. What do you mean by that?
The children's liberation movement just means that these professionals who created all of these programs, they kind of respected the interiority of children, the emotional intelligence of children. I think there was a period in the 50s when you had shows like Howdy Doody, which are, beloved by boomers, and Pinky Lee, who was kind of the inspiration for Pee Wee Herman in some way. But it was really shouty, noisy stuff. It was kind of, okay, you kiddies, we're going to entertain you. And I think that generationally, it wasn't just people like Mr. Rogers and Jim Henson, the Sesame Street people. It was also people like Maurice Sendak and Ursula Nordstrom, who was the children's book editor at Harper and Row, who said, hang on a minute, kids have an emotional life that's not being properly addressed by the literature or by the TV programming. And that's what I mean by a children's liberation movement, is suddenly you had all these media professionals and thought leaders saying, hey, kids deserve to be respected and spoken to as if they have interior lives.
There was also a strong social and political motivation to this programming. Can you talk a little bit about what they were trying to achieve, the founders of these programs, and we'll loop in Free to Be You and Me, which was a book and a program, into that?
It was a movement that came out of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society to some degree. There was a sense in the mid to late 60s that we would lift ourselves up by lifting up the least fortunate among us. Concurrently, you had the second wave feminist movement happening, and you had people like Gloria Steinem and Marlo Thomas, who is the star of the sitcom That Girl, saying, why can't we have a primer for children on gender politics and the idea that we're not siloed into specific roles by gender, that a woman can grow up and not have a husband, and a man can grow up acknowledging that it's all right to cry, as Rosie Greer memorably sang on that record and TV special.
What's funny is that now a lot of the gender politics of those shows, which were avant-garde at the time, or at least, progressive, are now kind of retrograde. Like if you think about the baby boy and the baby girl in Free to Be You and Me, that wouldn't fly at this point, having that either or binary.
It is extraordinary, but at the same time, Pamela, I think it's extraordinary that Free to Be You and Me, this TV special, aired in 1974 on ABC, mainstream network, and it still nevertheless was this radical primer on gender politics. And what's more, it wasn't just some coastal elite thing. Free to Be You and Me was turned into part of the curricula of 35 of 50 public school systems in the United States.
Speaking of ABC, that was also the home for Schoolhouse Rock, which you mentioned earlier, on Saturday mornings. I'm curious about the origins of, I don't even know what to call them. They were sort of these interstitial music videos that aired during Saturday morning cartoons.
Yeah, they were interstitial educational clips, and they were hatched by ad men. And so they were 3 minutes long, and they kind of had the concision and sticky factor of really well-formulated ads. And this goes back to my point that people were willing to do things out of the goodness of their own hearts, not for financial incentive. Schoolhouse Rock began as an idea in the head of a guy named David McCall, who ran a white shoe advertising firm in Manhattan called McCaffrey and McCall. He noticed his son was having a hard time mastering his times tables, but at the same time, the son could remember every lyric of a Rolling Stones song he heard on the radio or every lyric of a Budweiser beer jingle. So he said, what if we turn times tables, civics lessons, grammatical lessons like conjunction, junction, what if we made them into songs? And what if we got great animators to animate them? And ABC bought into this idea. And this was the first ad agency formulated TV program to win Emmys. It was, again, such an anomaly that these guys did it not quite pro bono, but in their spare time, they created this institution that even Barack Obama, a few years ago when he was president, was giving an interview to Chris Cuomo on CNN and said, well, if you want to remember how a bill is passed, you might remember this thing called Schoolhouse Rock, and I'm just a bill. And even Obama is referencing Schoolhouse Rock, 40 years later.
Tell us about Joan Gance Cooney and Lloyd Morrisett, the two founders of Sesame Street.
Joan Gance Cooney was from a well-to-do family in Arizona, and she felt the siren call of television when she graduated from college in the 1950s, back when TV was still a pretty exotic thing to work in. And she, in an almost peculiar way, saw TV not as a means of becoming famous or getting into entertainment. She was interested from the very beginning in harnessing the power of television to uplift the less fortunate. Like, she was really interested in poverty as her issue. She first worked for CBS, but then eventually got to the precursor to WNET, New York's current public TV station, doing documentaries on poverty. Meanwhile, Lloyd Morrisett is a guy who's working as a psychologist, and he's also working for the philanthropic Carnegie Corporation. They met through Joan Gance Cooney's cousin, Julian Gance, who was a mutual friend. And it's one of those Reese's peanut butter cups, you put chocolate in my peanut butter moments where it's the perfect match. Joan Gance Cooney was trying to address the ills of poverty. Lloyd Morrisett was saying, how about if we use use television to help children? And they merged their ideas. To that point, Joan Gance Cooney hadn't been thinking about children's programming. They merged their concepts, and that was sort of the embryonic form of Sesame Street.
It had such a curious mix of programming when you go back and you think about it, and when you look at those originals. And I was one of those people that went out and bought that series of DVDs that of the original seasons of Sesame Street when my kids were little. So nostalgic was I for the original versions of the show. And it's like this odd mix of these live sequences, puppetry, little animated sequences, and then these just sort of inexplicable bits of programming. There's one that's on a farm with cows sort of roaming around, and there's really no discernible action and just this kind of instrumental music background, which I guess was a sort of almost like a Fresh Air Fund kind of programming, presumably directed at fulfilling Joan Gance Cooney's vision of what inner city children needed. How did they come up with that lineup?
Well, it was a peculiar combination of Joan Gance Cooney was really taken by Laugh-In, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which, if you're a younger listener, was a late 60s variety show, comedy sketch show that had an incredibly amphetamine fast pace. And she loved the clip of that, the rapid pace. But at the same time, the Children's Television Workshop, which is what produced Sesame Street, had this fleet of cognitive pediatric psychologists and educators with these curricular goals. And some of these goals were things like learning letters, learning numbers, and some of it was also learning about worlds beyond your own world. So, if you were a rural viewer, you could learn about how a city worked. And if you were an urban viewer, you could learn how a farm worked. So that's part of why you had this peculiar cut-up mix of all this different stuff like you just described, Pamela.
I'm the king of 8, and I'm here to state that everything here has to total 8. The guards, for instance, by the gate, must always number exactly 8.
I have to ask you about a couple of my favorite among the animated sequences on Sesame Street, and probably more than anything is The King of 8, which anyone can watch now on YouTube and really should. Tell us a little bit about that one.
Well, Jim Henson didn't just do Muppets. He was so multi-talented. He did live action shorts, and that was a stop motion short. It was kind of a proto rap bit where the King of Eight talked about, he loved everything that numbered 8, including ultimately having 8 children. And it was just, again, this innate grasp of musicality and how kids would embrace something if it had a hook or a beat to it. And that was just an example of Jim Henson's mastery of this stuff. He did not come from a child psychology background, but he had a gift for that sort of entertainment and getting ideas across to kids in an entertaining way.
What was your favorite of the elements of Sesame Street?
Well, I have to confess that I loved the Muppets the most, and my particular favorite Muppet was Roosevelt Franklin.
Somebody call me by my first and last name.
Yes, I called you, and it's about time you got here, too. Now, will you please come on and recite your numbers?
All right, I'll do that. When I do, I'm going to count them just for you.
Well, we'll see if you know them for sure.
He was consciously developed as an African-American Muppet character. Even though his felt skin was purple, he was developed by Matt Robinson, who was a writer and producer on the show, who also played Gordon, who was kind of the black father figure in the first couple of seasons. Matt Robinson felt that the show wasn't doing enough to represent Black experience, even though Gordon and Susan were the human characters on the show. He said that the Muppets were great, but the default stance or character development of a Muppet was a white man, since most of the Muppet operators were white men. So he said to Jim Henson and Joan Gans Cooney, can we have this character who's a Black kid? And that became Roosevelt Franklin, who kind of spoke in this jivey patter and did a lot of funky or Stax-style soul songs. And I thought he was terrific, but not everyone did.
Was that the controversy, simply that he was a Black character on the show, or was there something else?
The reaction wasn't from white viewers in terms of controversy. It was actually within the Children's Television Workshop. There were some Black executives. There was a woman named Jane O'Connor, who's a school teacher who served as a curricular consultant. There was another producer named Luttrell Horn. There was the community outreach coordinator, whose name was Evelyn Payne Davis. They were all upper middle class. They all thought that Roosevelt Franklin was insufficiently aspirational, for lack of a better term. They thought he seemed too street. I believe Jane O'Connor said, he represents what we're trying to get away from. We as Black people are trying to get away from. Matt Robinson vociferously begged to differ. He said, no, if I'm a poor kid in Philadelphia, I want to see a character who talks like me and talks like my parents and my friends. And that became a big raging internal debate at Sesame Street. Meanwhile, I'm an oblivious white kid watching at home who just thinks this is the best character ever. And I'm not alone. I talked to Questlove, who wrote the foreword to my book, and April Rain of the Oscars So White movement. And they said, as young Generation X kids watching the show, Roosevelt Franklin was validating to them. They felt seen when they watched that character perform.
The name, it's so great. There was so much humor in that show. And it was, while it is a show for children and was a show for children, it did feel like they snuck in some elements there for the parents that they assumed would be watching alongside their kids. Although it was also, of course, notoriously a great babysitter. I mentioned earlier that I went out and I bought those DVDs of the original Sesame Street episodes, which were released like back when DVDs were released with much fanfare. And they famously contained warnings that some of the material was not suitable for young children. So what was that about?
Joan Gans Cooney always described the early seasons of Sesame Street as an experiment. There was no vision of this thing lasting 50 years, which it now has. And so they were more willing to take chances and honestly make mistakes. And so there's an advisory that these, what they call the old school Sesame Street DVDs, are strictly for adult viewing. Basically, they're selling it as a nostalgia view for people our age. I kind of beg to differ. I showed those things to my kids when they were young, and they were just as entertained. I think there's a greater sense of caution now. And there were some mistakes. Another Jim Henson live action bit was a counting bit, where he had a baker and the chef's cook. If the number was 2, they would focus on a different number. But if it was 2, and he would say, 2 chocolate cream pies. And then he would tumble head over heels down the stairs with everything crashing. One person who objected to that sequence was Fred Rogers, who said, I don't think that's a good thing to be showing young children, many of whom have only recently learned how to walk. it could be upsetting. And part of me thinks, oh, Fred Rogers, you priss, get over it. But it turns out I was reviewing the archives of Children's Television Workshop at the University of Maryland. They got a ton of letters making exactly Fred Rogers' point, which is to say Fred Rogers was ultimately right in that argument. And they actually pulled those segments because, again, that was a place where they experimented and they sort of failed. They kind of did make it too rough for young children.
How different is children's television today from that period?
I would say it's a lot safer. And I'm really, really reluctant to drag latter-day Sesame Street. I will admit that I don't enjoy it nearly on the level that I enjoy what they now call old school Sesame Street. But it's definitely safer, and it's partly by design because kids are so much more TV literate from birth now, or screen literate, let's say, that the average age of the Sesame Street viewer is no longer 4 or 5, it's 2 or 3. So the show has become more elemental, more preschool even. But I would kind of miss the wild and wooliness and the experimental quality of the earliest seasons.
I want to end with one last question, a show that you and I both enjoyed that I mentioned earlier and that not the entire country got to enjoy, which was The Magic Garden. Let's end on an upbeat note. Tell us a little bit about that show and what made it so special.
Well, again, the idea of widespread buy-in to doing public good. The FCC never made this a law, but they made it a kind of loosely enforced mandate that even commercial stations had to have television that served, quote unquote, the public interest. So WPIX, Channel 11, a local station in the New York City area, needed a kids show with quality content. And they got this young actress named Carol Demas, who used to be a school teacher, and she got her friend Paula Janis, who'd been a teacher in the Head Start program. And the two of them, wearing their long pigtails and their microfiber, multicolored outfits, sitting on swings, doing this cheery TV show called The Magic Garden, in which they just taught through song and really elemental kind of cardboard set stuff. But it was enchantingly sweet. And they also made a point of addressing people by name through the screen, not just greeting Jane and Henry. They made a point of mixing ethnicities as they greeted their viewers so that all kids felt seen and heard when they watched that program.
Me, I just felt like I wanted to live in the Magic Garden.
Right. And their parting song is See Ya. And you see those windows slowly closing. And a lot of people who are now adults talk about the sinking heart feeling when they were singing See Ya and the show was coming to an end. And Pamela, I suspect you're one of those people.
Oh, yeah. Hope you had a real good time. I remember it well. David, thank you so much for being here.
See ya.
Yeah, this was a cheery, upbeat segment. David Kamp's new book is called Sunny Days, The Children's Television Revolution That Changed America.
See ya. See ya. Hope you had a good time. Hope you'll have a good morning. Hope we get to see you again.
Joining us now is Elizabeth Harris to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Liz, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So Alexander Alter is on vacation this week, but Liz is also following the publishing industry for us and has noticed some interesting new things in book sales. What's going on?
So the nonfiction bestseller lists have a bunch of books about racism, how to be an anti-racist, systemic racism in the criminal justice system. And there are a bunch of them on this week that 2 weeks ago, almost none of them were here. And there's just been such an enormous shift in the national attention and conversation about this. I mean, there's How to Be an Anti-Racist came out last year, wasn't on the bestseller list at all 2 weeks ago, and is now number 5 in hardcover nonfiction.
So that's the Ibram Kendi book.
Yes, which is part memoir, part like instruction manual. Me and White Supremacy was also not on the hardcover nonfiction list and is on there this week, which helps readers understand their participation in white supremacy. My Vanishing Country, which is a memoir by Bakari Sellers about the Black working class. The New Jim Crow is now on the ebook and print combined list, and that came out in 2010.
That's from Michelle Alexander.
So You Want to Talk About Race is also one that's on the combined list, which has sections for white people who want to understand the way race functions in America. It has sections for people of color who are frustrated or feel misunderstood. On the paperback side, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo debuts at number 1. New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander is number 3. Just Mercy, which is a memoir by Brian Stevenson, who's a lawyer who founded the Equal Justice Initiative. That's number 6. And The Color of Law, which is about how segregation in American cities were the result of deliberate laws rather than people making individual personal choices.
And that's by Richard Rothstein.
Beat me to it. Yes, it is. It's so interesting. I mean, the list just looked completely different. Just 2 weeks ago, the White Fragility was low down on one of the lists, and Just Mercy was on one of the lists. But now there are so many on each of them in the hardcover section. It's fascinating.
It's an interesting question whether people want to read into the news or go away from it. I think that's one of the questions that the industry has sort of tried to read the tea leaves. It seems like both trends have been happening maybe simultaneously. And that first, of course, it was directed more toward the pandemic. And now it's shifting as the news cycle and as recent events have shifted over to issues of race and racism.
Yeah, I mean, the Great Influenza is still on the list. It's number 2 on the paperback nonfiction list. But there are a lot more books about racism on here than there are about sickness.
Is the same thing happening with regard to fiction, or is that where we're seeing people going more for big, familiar, commercial genre fiction names?
Yes, the fiction list isn't particularly topical to kind of what's in the news. There's Where the Crawdad Sings, Delia Owens is number 1, and the hardcover fiction Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng is number 1 on the trade paperback list. And there's a Hulu series starring Reese Witherspoon right now.
Actually, that book may be a kind of perfect storm of touching on topical issues about race and privilege. At the same time, it's just a really good, fast-moving story. And it's got the bonus of having a Hulu series with Kerry Washington and Reese Witherspoon in its favor.
Totally.
That's the way you do it. That's the way you get on the bestseller list. And good writing, we should say. Liz, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Liz Harris is covering the publishing industry. She's working alongside our regular Alexander Alter, who is off on a much-deserved vacation this week. Joining us now are critics Jennifer Salai and Parl Sagel. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's talk about the books that you each have reviewed recently. And I'm curious, just as background on that, are you finding that your choices of books have shifted during quarantine?
Yes, in the very practical sense that some books, the pub dates have just totally changed. So, we sometimes find out not necessarily at an opportune time, and then things have to switch out. But at the same time, also my sense of what I want to read, I think, has adjusted accordingly as well. And recently I reviewed something that was pretty unusual for me, which was a book about fungi, which we can get to in a minute.
Yes, I actually want to get to that right now. I was very perplexed and intrigued by your choice to write about a book on mushrooms. But I know it's not just mushrooms, right?
Not just mushrooms. I mean, if anything, so the book is called Entangled Life, and the subtitle is How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. And the author is Merlin Sheldrake. This is a book that points out that, if we think about fungi at all, which is not necessarily guaranteed, we tend to think about mushrooms because, they're the thing that everybody's familiar with, whether you think of, poisonous mushroom that you're not supposed to eat or an edible one that you are supposed to eat. And as he points out, the world of fungal networks is actually enormous, and you can find them almost everywhere. And the history of them and the biology of them are really intertwined with that of plants, which is also another organism that people tend to fixate on, he says, at the expense of really understanding how important fungi are. It's an interesting journey because he talks about studying fungi in Panama. And in order to study fungi, he has to actually scramble along the ground and really stay close to the ground, unlike other biologists who are, looking at things that are really obvious to the visible eye. I felt like this book, it just sort of opened up my understanding of how enormous the world is. And he's a vivid writer, and it's a very entertaining book. And he explains how fungi works in ways I think that people don't necessarily imagine, and also the ways in which they can maybe be put to use if we're trying to think about things like pollution or oil spills. Fungi have been trained to eat things like oil spills, which is sort of mind-blowing when you think about it.
When I was reading your review, I thought about my very limited knowledge of mushrooms. And most of it comes from other books where it's treated maybe more peripherally. Once in a book that I reviewed for the Times for a travel roundup about someone who was living in France studying food, and as part of that went truffle hunting truffle hunting hogs. And I wonder if there was any further discussion of that in this book.
Yes, actually, the first chapter is all about truffle hunting. Sheldrake heads out with a truffle hunter and his dogs in, I think, the hills of around Bologna. And so, he talks about the ways in which truffles, by having a very distinct smell, dogs that are specially trained, actually not even just trained, but there are some dogs that are actually bred specifically for this because truffles are so expensive and so valuable and so actually hard to procure. And so that was also fascinating because, he takes you into this world. I mean, truffles, again, is almost similar to the mushroom as maybe another fungus that people are more familiar with, but he really sort of shows you how this whole sort of ecosystem works around it.
The other book that I thought of, and there are shades of this in his subtitle, was How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, which came out a few years ago. And of course, hallucinogens, and there you're changing your mind. Here, the mushrooms are changing the world. I was curious, like the extent to which he covered hallucinogenics.
Oh, yes. He does cover them at several points in the book. And there is one chapter where he actually voluntarily entered a study where he took LSD under observation, which is a hallucinogen that's derived from a certain kind of fungus. And he also talks about psilocybin, which is a mushroom that's also a psychedelic. And, he talks about the various ways in which these psychedelics work. Not all of the mechanisms are totally understood, but, he describes this sort of feeling that they can induce of losing your sense of self, dissolving the boundaries of self, and reconceiving the world in an entirely new way. He talks about also people who have these theories about how psychedelics, the way that they colonize the mind, I guess is one way of thinking about it, which is that they colonize the mind of the host. And because of their effects, because they enable people to have these, what they describe as mystical experiences, that is an encouragement and an inducement for people to actually cultivate these mushrooms. So that's a way for these mushrooms to not only survive, but thrive.
I'm kind of fascinated by these books that, going back to Cod, the Mark Kurlansky book, The Fish That Changed the World, that sort of are these deep dives into this one creature, and they use it as a lens through which to tell like the story of history and prehistory and the future. And recently there's this new book, The Book of Eels. There was Cy Montgomery's book about the octopus. Like they all sort of call my name. And Parl, I'm interested in your take on this too. Like, are you drawn to these single subject books or allergic to them, or?
Oh, I'm such a sucker for these books. Any book called Mosquito or Salt or Dirt or all of these like single. I think that there's something about coming at history from these odd angles that is very appealing. And some of these books really make a powerful case. I don't know if any of you guys read the book Mosquito, that's sort of a history of malaria and how the fear of malaria and the threat of malaria really shaped human history. So things like that, I think, they don't feel gimmicky when you actually get into the argument, you get into the evidence. But yeah, I mean, I can imagine like on my bedside table, I have like half a dozen books with one name titles, like Bed. I'm the sucker buying all of these books. I think.
What about you, Jen? Like, is this, I mean, I don't see you reviewing a lot of these, but maybe it's your secret side passion.
I tend not to be drawn to those books. And I mean, I have to admit that maybe, part of it is just sort of a reflexive action rather than something that's really thought out. But I will say that when the writer is really good and when, they're really sort of able to show how, I don't know if you would call them objects. I feel like that's not really quite the word for it. But when these phenomena really open up our way of seeing things. And, in this instance with fungi, he really shows how they offer almost new metaphors, I guess, for understanding who we are as well as what the world is. There's something really wonderful in that. And I think there was something really enjoyable and great about reading a book like this at this time.
The most interesting metaphor, I think, for me was that wood wide web, which came up also in the Michael Pollan. But
Yes.
talk about the aphids and the wasps and the fungi.
So originally, before plants evolved their own root systems, they were provided by fungal networks. And so, the fungal networks still provide, just sort of at a basic level, they often provide nutrients to plants. What he says is that they also offer a way for plants to communicate with one another. One of the examples he gives is if one plant in a fungal network is attacked by aphids, it can send out what's called a chemical shriek that's then transmitted through the fungal network to the other plants in the network. And so even if the original plant dies from this aphid attack, the other plants can protect themselves by emitting their own chemicals that draw, another predator to attack the aphids.
Is this a metaphor for Twitter? I mean,
I think it's a pandemic metaphor. We're all emitting our low-level chemical
shrieks,
right now.
Yeah.
Calls in the wasps to attack.
Yeah. That's one way they work. And, he also says that, the wood wide web's metaphor, actually, it's interesting. He talks about it a little bit where he points out that there are some critics of the metaphor who think that the wood wide web metaphor is too utopian because sometimes fungal networks can transmit things like viruses. So plants can become infected through the fungal network. But it is interesting to think about it. And there is a lot of punning in I guess, the world of mycology, which is the world of people who are interested in fungi, which is a marriage between a fungus and an alga. One of the terms that's used is ways of enlightenment to represent how people become enlightened, I guess, with their interactions with lichens.
I reviewed a very different book this week. It's a second novel, but it is a novel very, very preoccupied with identity. I reviewed Britt Bennett's second novel, The Vanishing Half, which is about two sisters who grow up in a small town in Louisiana that is established for light-skinned Black people. And as they grow up, the sisters flee the small town, and one lives as a white woman and the other one lives as a Black woman. And the story sort of follows this, consequences of the secret that this one sister keeps, as well as her disappearance. And Britt Bennett she's a young writer. She's incredibly assured. This book spans 20 years of sort of rich family history. It goes into the town. It goes into all kinds of secret lives and stuff, but very, very swiftly. She really has created a tight, almost narrative machine. And, in my review, I try to situate this book in the tradition of passing narratives in American literature and say that this is a very uniquely American form. And as we've seen the form evolve from early experiments with 19th century, I think actually maybe more early 20th century literature and films like Imitation of Life and Pinky. And I try to ask, how each successive wave of passing narratives is changing the form, what it's adding to the conversation, the question of why pass maybe, or the consequences of passing aren't quite so important, not, or quite so focused on, but they're sort of exploring other kinds of ramifications, other kinds of tones. You see passing narratives that are comic or playful or not as earnest as that early sort of iteration were. And in this book, I feel like Bennett is asking a bunch of questions that I haven't seen. For example, what if you have a character who passes and isn't punished in the traditional way that characters who pass are, or suffers a great deal, or repents? It's not to say that the character in this particular book doesn't have very, very ambivalent feelings, doesn't feel alienated after suppressing her identity and living a life pretending to be somebody else, but she isn't really punished in that same Baroque way that these characters usually are. And I think Bennett is interested in a different series of questions, a different series of narratives about this experience. And I really admired the book. I felt like she did sacrifice a little depth for swiftness and for covering a lot of ground and mapping the consequences of one person's decisions across generations, when for me, it left me with a lot of questions. I wanted to sort of burrow in deeply into one's psychology a little bit more. I wanted a little bit more of that kind of intimacy. But, it's a second novel and it's incredibly immersive and absorbing and, a fine introduction to a writer's work who I think is going to go on and keep doing very, very interesting work.
How did this compare with The Mothers, her first novel?
I love second novels. I think that second novels tend to be less autobiographical. They tend to be more exploratory. You can feel the sort of writer trying different strategies. So I enjoyed it more. I admired it more, I have to say, for the kinds of risks it takes. I also admired it because she does something that I really like in fiction. Sometimes writers are criticized for showing their influences too much, especially younger writers. And I really like the way that Bennett gestures towards the writers that matter to her. Toni Morrison, Nella Larson, I can feel in this book, Dorothy Allison, especially because it's a book about passing and suppressed lineage. So I think to have these moments or these small scenes where I could feel homages, I could feel a gesture, I could feel something in the rhythm that reminded me of these writers that influenced her, that felt very affectionate. And it felt sort of that it was a certain kind of tethering to a form, a certain kind of matrilineal lineage almost in these books that felt very powerful to me.
It sounds like this is a very assured voice for a second novel.
Yeah, the voice is assured. The execution is really, really amazing, how she slips back and forth from flashbacks into the present and can pan out and suddenly embody the voice of a town and have these other little interludes. Like, I think, voice is something that we talk about so much with writers. But with novels of this size and scope, I almost feel like pacing can be the real star. Pacing is what keeps you going, the rhythm of the book, the rhythm of the way the information is being divulged to you, and how a writer almost choreographs that. I'm not sure if that's the right verb, but you know what I mean. How you sort of conduct that is...
Well, yeah, I was going to say orchestrate.
Orchestrate is the verb, right? Because I think when you're doing that, you have to sort of almost keep in mind as you're writing how the book is being read, and the feeling the reader has. You have to toggle between the two. So I think the way that she has put together this book and orchestrated it and moved it between moments of intensity and interiority to jumping ahead in time and back in time without it feeling jarring, without it feeling gimmicky, without it feeling artificial, I really admired. Because her voice actually in the book is rather clean. It's not too voicey. The beginning, I think, channels Morrison a lot, but then she slips into her own tone, which is almost impersonal, that sort of like absolute lens that she can sort of blend with the character. But yeah, there's a lot going on in this book that is really ambitious and very successful, even though, of course, I'm going to have my quibbles.
All right. I can feel, and you maybe can sense from the editor on this line, the need for a Pearl Sagal essay on second novels. Yeah. We all have thoughts about debut fiction, and you have thoughts about second novels.
Second novels are my favorite. It's like I always love eldest children in every family. Like I love the oldest child for whatever. As an oldest child, I don't know. I feel their struggle in the way that there's something about the second novel. It's melancholy. It's sort of plaintiveness. It's sort of lack of recognition sometimes. I just love it. I find it. Yeah. So let's schedule that one.
All right. I feel there's not much to say about the third, but perhaps we can touch on that next time. All right. Let's run down those titles again. Jen, what did you review?
I reviewed Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures by Merlin Sheldrake.
And Pearl?
I reviewed The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett.
All right. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.